Hello everybody, my name is Thomas Elgeling. Welcome to this session about the Salesforce integration and API overview. I am a member of the European Cloud Architects team based in Munich in Germany. So I would present for the next 20 minutes some introduction into the Salesforce integration capabilities with a strong focus on some practical examples for the API and how to work with the different integration approaches with Salesforce. So first of all, you know this slide. Please make all your buying decisions on a currently available feature set. It's part of our forward-looking statement. What I suggest or expected from this audience today is, so who are you? My expectation was you have a certain level of experience with integration. It's about APIs, different type of APIs, technologies, things that are used to move data around, invoke certain services. But also maybe from a point of view how your experiences with Salesforce, a kind of newbie maybe, right? So maybe a Salesforce administrator, or starting to begin in Salesforce developer in the context of how to integrate data with Salesforce with external applications. So let's start with some intros and overviews. So you heard so many times that Salesforce is a platform, and I will always wonder myself, what makes a platform? Is it just about executing some program code? Is it about executing some logic? And my feeling and strong belief is that a platform is not just that. It also has to work on things like how do we protect the data? How do we implement things like sharing and access and identity management? How do we provide a direct capability to report and search about all the information that is stored in the platform? Things to easily modify the metadata that is part of the platform. And finally, make it all accessible instantly through a set of different APIs. So that is a key unique differentiator where I strongly believe makes the Salesforce platform so powerful. So there are different use cases where integration becomes very important, right? From my experience, very often it is about kind of master data integration, where records stored on multiple places about customer, about contacts, about product information, for example, has to be synchronized in different directions. And it all starts typically with some kind of export, import, very often once a day, or maybe in lesser or larger intervals. And there are other scenarios where integration becomes important, where we meet a more type of real-time record-level integration, where it comes to not just back-end integration between an SAP system, you know, coming from the country where I live and was born, or maybe mobile application integration, where an end user needs, a consumer needs the direct interaction with information stored and managed in the Salesforce platform. So the variety of different user or integration scenarios requires the capabilities from the platform to support this variety of application integration. So we have at the top level, for example, the different types of applications, devices, or maybe middleware in place. And on the lower level, we have all the different types of integration functionality that Salesforce provides. I will not go directly on each and every type of API and integration. I will highlight some of the, let's say, fundamentals and then pick 2 or 3 that are very important. So typically from the developer point of view, what are the tool sets? What is the tool set that you should use where you are supported in working with the Salesforce API? The first one that I would recommend is the Workbench. So that's a part of the Salesforce ecosystem developed by Salesforce and made available to the community. Or what's coming up now is the API Explorer, where you can easily scroll through the API that is exposed as REST services from the developer's website. Salesforce DX, of course, provides you a command line interface where you can also interact with the metadata. But there are also third-party tools that are recommended here, tools like SOAP UI or Postman, who have also the whole tool set around automated testing and so on, right? And last but not least, the good old curl, so command line invocation of interfaces. As I said, there are some dependencies existing. So first of all, it's all about authorization and an identity. You will never have the ability to invoke a service on the Salesforce platform without a proper authorization step. So you need to be an identity with user profile, a license, but also the permission sets, and all the information that is implemented in the permission sets and the sharing rules will be applied also on the API level, which is very important. So that could happen, for example, that you wonder, why do I not see a certain field on my API request? Maybe the reason is because the user that you are using to interact with the API has simply do not have the permissions, right, for the sharing rules. And the authorization here is typically based on an OAuth security token. So the whole OAuth standard is used to interact with the Salesforce platform. We know the concept of a connected app in Salesforce, where you can configure the session policy, how long a security token is valid, and here those standards are used. Another very important dependency is how do we get access to the data? So how do you query the information? And Salesforce has different ways to get access to those APIs, to those data sets. First of all, it's of course access to structured information through the Salesforce Object Query Language, SOQL query language, very similar to the SQL standards. But also we have a very powerful search engine. All the information is captured in a search index, and we provide an API to use this search engine for the Salesforce Object Search language. It's a different syntax, but also very powerful to retrieve information out of the system. And the third one is what we know as a parameterized search, where very similar to a Google search syntax, you just simply pass some query strings, and the search index is then used to get the information out of the platform. So the way how we do the customization finally is, as you all know, low-code, no-code principles in Salesforce, but also coding principles in Salesforce. So there's a capability inside Salesforce to program with Apex code, things like invocable methods. These are Apex classes that expose a certain method that can then itself be reused in the context of, for example, the process builder. So you all have seen probably the process builder, where you can select a certain action that should be executed once a certain condition was met. And for example, posting a message to a Slack channel can be encapsulated in an Apex class, and we will see it later in the demo how this can be done. So once we have now understand the basic concepts of identity, authorization, and the APIs, let's take a closer look to things like how do we do an data access, how we do operations like creating records, reading, updating, deleting records. On the record level itself, Salesforce exposes standard web service technologies that are implemented on HTTP protocol with REST API and SOAP APIs, right? And for those endpoints that we are providing, for example, for standard objects, but also on custom objects, those are immediately generated based on the metadata that is captured as part of your Salesforce org. So if you are adding a new field, for example, to a custom object or a standard object, this field becomes immediately accessible on the API side, which is very powerful. So you don't need an extra deployment step or so to expose the information. That's what I mean with the power of the platform. So let's take a closer look in how this might work. As I've mentioned before, maybe some of you know from the Trailhead DX our Dreamhouse sample org that can be easily installed. Here it is about brokers. This is a custom object record where I have broker information about one of my colleagues, Caroline. And I want to show you how to get access to Caroline's record information from an API perspective. So for this reason, I have opened here a second tab where I have my workbench. And the first thing I want to show you and highlight is that from the history of Salesforce APIs, we have a very long list of different APIs based on our 3 releases every year. We know exactly which API was released what date, and customers, they implement their integration endpoints against a certain version of the Salesforce API. So this means that once we are upgrading our platform, our release cycles, your integration points are still stable. I have customers who have started their integration 8 years ago without touching the integration endpoints since then. And 3 times a year, a major upgrade of Salesforce, it's still working. That's also another aspect of the platform. So let's log in with the login credentials and jump right into the utilities to browse through the Explorer, the REST Explorer. So as I said before, we have now here a list of different API calls in version 41. When I go back to version 20, the first version where we had the REST APIs, you see it's a much smaller number, nearly half of it. So over time we have increased, of course, the capabilities of the platform. So this was very important here for the life cycle of your APIs. So let's go to the latest ones. And I have here created my sample scripts on a GitHub repository, which I am happy to share with you later on. So let's simply invoke this service to execute a query against my SOQL statement. So selecting an ID, name, and email from the custom object broker returns a result with different records, like, for example, Caroline Kingsley, my colleague that I've seen previously on my tab. So when I now want to go into more details, like, okay, I want to manipulate the information from Caroline, let's first start with the describe. That's an operation that's exposed as well on my REST API that helps me to better understand the structure, what are the different layouts. Every information accessible from the metadata API is also here listed on this view, right? So from another operation, I want to select all the information that are available from the fields and simply copy and paste here again for a specific record, which is, funny enough, the record ID of Caroline. So let's execute, and we will see all the fields from Caroline, including her picture information, title, whether her status is active or not. Yeah. So let's use the same to update the information. And updating of information in a REST context means sending a patch request to her. And I need to type in some JSON code here. So we are referencing, for example, her title. And change the value into a principal consultant. Execute on this, and this update is immediately then sent to the API following all the automation rules. And when we do a refresh, her title has changed, hopefully from Senior Broker, not yet, to Principal Consultants. So it takes a while until we refresh the cache. So this information is now really pushed to the API through the REST interface. Let me show you more details about other APIs. So we have mentioned the REST API, but also the concept of integrating external information that not necessarily resides in our Salesforce database systems can be integrated and made integrated and linked to other existing applications and objects inside our Salesforce platform. We have a feature for this which is called Salesforce Connect that is used to integrate any external OData endpoint. So, for example, your SQL Server database supports OData. The SAP application system supports OData. And you can use those OData server endpoints to read from them the structure, the metadata, but also the information itself, and use this internally in Salesforce as what we call external objects. So we are syncing the schema information, the metadata, what are the fields, what are the data types per field, and create internally in Salesforce another category of object, the so-called external object, which I will always say looks, smells, tastes like a custom and standard object, but the only difference is here the data is not stored within Salesforce, the data is stored outside. So think of invoice information of accounts, think of shipping information of a specific order, and this information is not necessarily available inside Salesforce, it is stored outside. So therefore no data duplication, and all the mastered system of record lives outside of Salesforce. So let me also go to a quick demo on this. So I go to the setup of my Salesforce org, and you find here in the quick link under external data sources, the base configuration of my OData endpoint. So when we take a look in this configuration, you see that there are different options available. First of all, Salesforce Connect supports different type of server protocols, not just OData. You can also implement your own if you do not have an endpoint that understands OData standard. There are also things like, do I want this external data source be a writable object, or do I only want to have it, my invoice and shipping information, as an read-only information? We allow things like a global search, so things that we have seen before with the SOCL and SOCL queries. You can also apply about the information that is stored outside. A global search in the search field at the top of our window is not only about information stored in Salesforce, but also about information that is stored outside in an external object. It's also very powerful. Of course, the whole identity configuration allows not just an anonymous access, like in my example, but also what we have here as a named principal, a technical user from our OData interface, the one user who has access to all records, or we can have it per user base. So apply the permissions and the roles of the user that sits in front of the Salesforce system and have access to the records that are stored in my SAP application, right? Based on the profile that I have on my SAP login. So once we have created the information here, we have a set of different objects listed, like orders, for example, or my payment mechanisms that are stored in my external application, which is very simple, where I have here my payment mechanisms listed. Once I create or change my list view to all entries, I see simply here my external ID based on the information. It takes a while to retrieve the records from my external database. Yeah. So this is also a very powerful mechanism where we have benefits of the integration and API capabilities of Salesforce. So finally, when we talk about the Apex integration services, this is something where it's more about coding, where we have things like an invocation from an external SOAP or REST service. And the simple call-out mechanism usually involves three types of objects, right? We need to create a request object where we are setting the endpoint, where we are setting the method, a get, a post method or so. And of course, we are setting the body. Then we are creating a new HTTP object, and we're receiving here, once we are executing the HTTP send command, we are receiving an HTTP response, which itself contains a response from my service provider, for example, a JSON result. And we are encapsulating, for example, here a service endpoint. There's another way how we are integrating APIs in our Salesforce system. Think of not just those base operations of a get and put or a patch of a record. Think of a more complex orchestration requirement where we have, for example, when we are creating a new support case in Salesforce, not just the insert in our case object, but maybe first an SLA validation check. If the customer that is now creating a case is eligible, what about the asset that we want to create this case on? So if it's an orchestration of different invocations, then we encapsulate this in a more granular, let's call it macro service, that is then used from your external client to invoke, for example, the case creation. And therefore we are providing here those very declarative mechanisms to create REST resources in the platform. So I have 1 or 2 minutes left, so let's jump into a demo where we are showing how to integrate Salesforce with Slack, a very popular communication platform these days. So in my example, I have properties that have a certain status, right? Status like it's available, or it's under an agreement, or it's already sold. And I want an integration where once my property is changed in status to sold, all those one opportunities or one properties should be published to my Slack channel that I have opened up here in a separate tab, where I call this my one channel, right? All the Dreamhouse automated messages should be published into this channel. How do we do that? So, as I said, we have an Apex class that contains my code, the Slack publisher this is in my case. And here we have different hooks implemented. So this Slack API provides a very simple webhook mechanisms where I simply post an HTTP request. That's something that my service provider, in my case the Slack system, provides as an endpoint. Then we are configuring the different record elements that I want to pass over to my endpoint, like what is the name of the object that has changed, what is the field, what is the old value, what is the new value. I expose what we call an invocable method, so that afterwards, when I've implemented this Apex class, I can use the same process, the same activity in my process builder. So post property status to Slack is my process model, where we have the post to Slack action with the Apex class post records changes to Slack. And once I, for example, take a look at the Prince Street, which is available, and I change the status from available to sold, my Slack channel hopefully gets an update. Does it? Let's take a look. Well, anyhow, my time has left off, over now. If you have any additional questions, let me just finish up here. A new message has arrived. It's about a network at the Dreamforce. Sorry about that. Right. So you see here now the status is now automatically sent from Dreamhouse to our clients and all the listeners on the Slack channel. So what we have seen now is the different overview of APIs that are available on the Salesforce platform, and make yourself more familiar if you want to learn more about it on Trailhead platform. Right, there are different badges and modules available, like the API Basics, which I can highly recommend, or visit one of our colleagues here where we are talking more about things like platform events and integration and so on. Thank you very much for this.